Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do the conflagration at Bellflower Street. Took place in 1964 in Boston. And we've got three people, couldn't be better for walking us through this analysis of Bellflower. First, Mike Foley, who you all know if you've been watching the channel, retired Boston fire lieutenant, many years on the job, was working during the war years. Then we have retired Boston Fire Commissioner / Chief Paul Christian, who, from my understanding, went from firefighter on probation to deputy fire chief in 14 and a half years. Quite a feat. And then we have Erik Pettaway, went from firefighter on probation to district chief in 13 and a half years. And he's currently working on the Boston Fire Department, so he'll let you know about his career. But you guys went from like privates to generals.
Yeah, not many people do that. Very few, ever.
Yeah, and I don't say that just to embarrass you. I say it because in the short time I've known you guys love the profession, but you love the study of the profession. To me, as a layman, you do your homework, you enjoy the fire science behind it. So with that said, does somebody want to explain the Bellflower Street fire, what took place there? I mean, just an overall summary before we get into it.
If I could just comment on your opening remarks about the firefighters, how they work together and seem to be on the same page. These firefighters, and they were the World War II guys, as you mentioned. Boston was going through an extremely busy period of fire from the early 60s on. Just the year before, they had the Bellflower Street fire in October 63, which was another conflagration. That same year, just down the street from the Bellflower Street fire was the Russell Boiler Works, another 5-alarm fire, and that exposed 3 deckers, and engine 3 got the side of it burned in that fire. So where I'm going with this is these firefighters knew from their experience working together how each of them worked, what's expected, and what the tactics are that we do in Boston. So it was no stranger to them on how to react and how they handled the fire. They would be thinking the same things as Chief Green was coming down Dorchester Avenue and Chief Klaus was coming in. They could see what they had. They knew the area. They knew the weather conditions. So they were all kind of tuned into what's going on, and they knew each other. So that's just to set the preface for how the tactics evolved that day.
Yeah, and that's something when I was researching this, is especially talking to Mike, the experience that you just outlined is what impressed me. Now, we'll talk about it further down, whether today it's the same synergism with firefighters that these guys had back in the day when they were fighting a lot of fires. Another question I have, without getting ahead of ourselves here, if you guys can take a look at what it was May, I believe, 1964, been extremely dry. Set us up to, what the conditions were for almost a perfect storm. And also, besides the weather, the homes, somebody called them vertical lumber yards. I don't know who came up with that definition, but you're on the truck, you're getting there. Talk about the weather, talk about what you see happening, talk about the homes and how they're tinderboxes. Can we start there?
Well, the 3-decker type construction became very common in Boston in the late 1800s. And throughout East Boston, South Boston, Dorchester, and other parts of the city, they were a very economical way of building housing. And it made people with not too much money able to afford a house, and the rents of the 2 other apartments would help pay the mortgage. So the 3-deckers were 3 floors. They were built entirely of wood. Wood was abundant. And so the Boston, I think, has more 3-deckers per square foot than any other section. But the weather conditions, beside it being a dry, windy day, we had been through a prolonged drought starting back in 1963. And it doesn't take too long for these 3-deckers to dry out and become more apt to ignite when there is a fire. So that was, the weather conditions were against us. The condition of that neighborhood was remarkable in that it was a very well-kept neighborhood. It was not deteriorated at all as some neighborhoods were, but this was really well-kept. The property was maintained good. So you referred to this being the perfect storm. So I'd say between the configuration of these wooden buildings, the drought, the low humidity, and the high winds that day, it was indeed the perfect storm for this fire, the way it broke out, the way it spread.
So where did it start?
Supposedly on the back porch of number 26 Bellflower Street. I don't know that they ever definitively found it, but that's where they surmised it started. Supposedly in an overstuffed chair. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I don't think they know either, but that's what they said. So that's kind of the generally accepted version.
Can you set up the three fire scenario when they got there? First Kennedy, and then how the chiefs and who the chiefs were who set up three different fires, if I'm correct there?
Well, I'll start with Jimbo Kennedy, with the lieutenant on ladder 20. And every fire officer from lieutenant all the way up to deputy chief subscribes to well, it's an old acronym. It's probably changed now, but the first is size up, then you have sufficient help, then you have life hazard and exposure. Those are the first four. Jimbo Kennedy sized up the fire from a quarter of a mile away, knew what he had. Sufficient help, he ordered a second alarm immediately, which more than doubled his first alarm response. The next concern is life safety. Now, when ladder 20 arrived at Bellflower Street and Boston Street, he almost instantly recognized that the life hazard wasn't going to be an issue. So he had the ladder truck backed across the street, out of the way. Normally they would go into the front of the building to ladder the building, but he said, we're not going to need that ladder truck, get it out of here. And then immediately started to run a line of hose to protect an exposure. So subconsciously or otherwise, he went through those first four steps. And every officer is obliged to do that. So he took the first initial steps, and then from there, then the district chief arrived, and then the deputy chief arrived, and they do the same thing, only on a much, much larger scale in this case. But Kennedy did exactly what he had to do, and the first arriving engines did the same thing. Although engine 21, Paul, I think they went into a deck gun, but 43 ran a hand line instead of the deck gun because of the maneuverability. And ladder 20, they ran a hand line also. So the idea of all the deck guns wasn't necessarily the way they went for the rest of the fire.
And that was due to the fact that it was a fast-moving fire. It was the other side of the street. Deck gun is attached to the apparatus, and it's very immobile. So they would see hand lines. They could see they were going to have to move. The fire was extended on several fronts. The rear of the building on the Dorset Street side was exposing the buildings on Dorset Street, a similar row of three-deckers. And the fire at the same time was jumping right across Bellflower Street, moving up towards Howell Street. Yep. So mobility, they knew they were going to need. One of the problems they faced, I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself on this, was the nozzles that they used that day. On the big lines, that's our 2.5-inch line, it was the Boston play pipe, which was an adjustable tip, which they put in the mid-50s, following a report on firefighting methods. They thought that you could just use a spray nozzle on interior fires and put it into a room and close it up and spray it with water, and the steam would put the fire out. That came out of a report in the early 50s based on people with experience with shipboard fires in the Navy. However, this day, it does have a position where you can put it on solid stream, and because of the design of the nozzle, you really don't get a good solid stream out of it. And the wind was breaking the streams up. That was one of the big drawbacks that they faced at that particular fire. In fact, immediately after that fire, they went around, took all those Boston adjustable tips away from the company and replaced them with the inch and an eighth straight tips. But getting back to the devices, the deck gun on the apparatus, they were going mobile. They didn't want to commit the apparatus too deep into the street because the way the fire was moving, the apparatus would have been trapped and it would have been destroyed. Fortunately, they didn't lose any apparatus, but they did use mobility as one of the major tactics. Mike mentioned how ladder 20 ran lines. What we do in big fires like that is the ladder companies get the ladder truck out of the way and they'll take hose lines off of the engines there. So those are, in effect, became engine companies at that fire in the early stages.
Well, the question, you're currently working, Eric, you're the only one of the group that's still working. Fire like this, and you being a chief and you come and you look at this, what do you feel, if it was happening today? One, do you think a fire like this could happen again in the neighborhood? I'm assuming it could. And two, what do you think of what these chiefs did and how they set this up compared to today? What would be different? That's a tough question, I know.
No. I would say personally, and I just use some of my own experiences, something like that, and you see the pictures. You're trying to get ahead of the fire and stop the spread. So you almost probably have to write off the first couple of buildings. One I had similar, it ended up only affecting 3 decades, but it was kind of similar conditions. And that was the original goal, was to try to keep it to the original 4 buildings and not have it keep jumping down the street. So I can imagine then, I can imagine coming out of quarters, everybody responding could see smoke or something. So they started formulating a plan. And because I'm a firm believer in knowing your district, I'm sure those first alarm companies knew that area like their backyard. And you got to realize that some buildings are just, there's nothing you could do. Stop the spread. Hopefully no one gets hurt. And for the original fire buildings, it's almost like public relations. You'll squirt some water, but they're gone. That's what I would be thinking coming out of quarters.
One of the
Interesting. I'm
first
sorry, go ahead, Paul.
One of the first tactics they had deployed that day was flanking the fire and channeling it. Chief Green and Klaus, they knew that they did have a fire break going towards the Dorchester Avenue, that you had the Southeast Expressway on the northeast end of this fire. So, which is similar to what happened at the Morgan Memorial Fire. If they didn't have the Fort Point channel, that fire would have gone right into South Boston. In this case, they had the expressway, so they concentrated their efforts on flanking it, coming in from Dorset Street on one side, Howell Street on the other side, keeping it contained into that channel going towards the expressway, which is where it was being pushed. So that was very effective. As Eric just mentioned, these fellows are no strangers to these areas. They do pre-fire planning all the time. I remember after the Plant Shoe fire, talking with George Paul, and he was the commissioner at the time. And when he was in District 9, he used to go down and pre-fire that. So our guys are always thinking they know the water supply, they know the hazards, and in their minds they go over, how would I attack this? What would I do with this particular fire? And you mentioned, Derek, again about the companies being able to see it. I was working on Longwood Avenue at the Deaconess Hospital. I was up on the roof, and I looked over and I saw this cloud of smoke, and the base of the smoke, I had never seen anything like it. It looked almost like the Chelsea fire all over again. I thought it was a junkyard from the distance because of the volume of smoke and the width of the base of the fire. I couldn't imagine it was a row of 3 decades going to achieve that intensity and volume of fire.
That must have been, well, we should bring up Mike. Out of everybody here, you're the only one who was actually at the fire.
Yeah.
So can you just tell us quickly how you got there?
Well, yeah. I went over, I was visiting my father in the firehouse, engine 43 and ladder 20. And they're the first, the ladder 20 was where Jimbo Kennedy worked at the time. So we were really close. And when we heard the box came in and they sent the truck out in the engine, we looked out the back window of the firehouse and you could see the smoke. So I went outside and my father was going to go over in the chief's car, but they had a dead battery. He was driving Bob Regan that day in Old District 12. So I jumped into someone's car. I don't know who he was, My father went into the trunk and he gave me his helmet and a dungaree jacket. And he said, go. And just before we left the little parking lot, you know where it is, Paul, behind the firehouse near the kitchen windows. Before we left there, he threw a pair of work shoes in through the window at me. And I looked out and he was in his sock feet. He had taken his own shoes off and given them to me. And when I got there at the same time as Freddie Klaus, the division commander. I was running up the street and he was outside the car putting on his fire coat. That's how I remember. And I had met him a few times, so I knew who he was. But it was unlike anything you'd ever expect to see. And that's when I went down the street. Jimbo Kennedy, he said, Mike, help me, drag some hose. So I was dragging the hose down Bellflower Street. And all of a sudden, I turned and I felt I to pull more hose, and I felt this enormous blast of heat on my back, and I ran away. And I went down however many feet, turned around, and the fire had jumped Bellflower Street. And that's when Bob Green, the first arriving district chief, he had been on the other side of where it jumped, so he was trapped. He couldn't get back to his original location. He wound up being on the other end of Bellflower Street over there with Chief Flaherty was over. Flaherty was with him, Paul, I think, on the other side.
Yes.
Yeah. So the acting chief of department wound up over there with the first district chief.
Yeah, one comment Bob Green made to me when I was discussing it with one time was he had struck the third or fourth alarms and he got on the other side of the fire, as you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And he ran to ladder 7 to get to a radio. We didn't have portable radios then. And he couldn't get through. He wanted to strike the 5th alarm, but he couldn't break through the radio traffic all coming in.
I don't know if I told you the story, but I asked him many years later at headquarters, what was he thinking when that happened? Because he had run down between two of the buildings and seen the fire spreading toward Dorset Street. I said, what was running through your mind? He said, and he laughed. He says, I got to tell you, he said, when I saw it all, I remembered all the water that I saw from the deck of my ship in the South Pacific, and I was wishing I had some of that water here right now. Thank you, so. Anyway.
One tip Bob Green gave me when I first made district chief was he said, Paul, he says, whenever you get to a fire, have your aide go to the back of the building and take a look and see what you have in the back.
Okay.
I looked different in the front, but I think, I don't know if it grew out of the Bellflower Street
Probably.
fire experiences there. But he said, get somebody in the back, take a look at it and see what you got. And that always stuck with me, and I passed that along to other new chiefs.
Let me ask a question. So you get to the fire and you said they didn't have the communications equipment, portable radio. So they have to kind of be thinking on the same wavelength without talking to each other. Is that true? Knowing what this group's going to do, that group's going to do. Is that right?
But what I believe happened that day, you can correct me, Mike, if I'm wrong, is when they were striking these alarms, they'd say, have the third alarm companies come in Dot Ave to Dorset or come in this way. They just give the general areas where they go into. And again, this goes back to what Mike mentioned, how we have the order of operations. We do it without even thinking. These companies come in, you didn't have to tell them what to do. They needed to get big lines, get their connected to a water supply, get those big lines in the back. You didn't have to give these guys piecemeal instructions. They knew it from their years of experience, the company officers, just what was needed and what to do. So it was up to Chief Green, Chief Klaus to call for the additional help, to redirect the forces as they saw fit on that day. But the company officers, they were basically on their own on running those lines and seeing the severest points of exposure to play their water.
Well, there was only 2 ways into each Dorset, Bellflower, and Howell. There's only 2 ways into each one of them from Boston Street or Dorchester Avenue. So you're right. So they were able to surround it because of that. If the streets were configured differently, it might have been a different story, but it wasn't.
Let me follow up on that. Let me ask you, how bad could this fire have gotten given the conditions if things weren't done exactly right? How far beyond 19 homes and what we know was the damage, how far could it have gone? Theoretically.
They were looking at the expressway, but I think they wanted to stop it at Dorchester Avenue. That was their original thing. Wherever you could get a fire break, be similar to a forest fire. You're looking for that break in the combustibles to be able to stop the spread of fire. What would have really made things worse would have been if this had been in weather like we're having now with frozen hydrants. We were very fortunate that day that they could establish good water supply flow at that particular fire. I'm sure they were running over 20,000 gallons a minute easily there. But there were good water supply both on Dorchester Avenue and Boston Street. Those are good water mains there. Good volume of water there. So the companies did not have a water problem that day. So that was a plus. Whereas given some fires we've had in the winter with frozen hydrants, and I've seen some little fires turn into real big ones when you don't have water.
The other issue, as far as how far it could have gone, Joe, I'm not sure how many companies there were, but there were at least 3 or 4 that were tasked with going around the general area looking for roof fires. And there were over 200. The embers from the Bellflower Street fire had gone all over the neighborhood and started small, tiny little fires on rooftops. So that's an issue as well.
Well, they brought in 19 surrounding communities, mutual aid, that's what you guys call it, right?
Yeah.
So that's 19 communities that came in. Talk about that. What did they do?
They probably I don't know, supplement pumped. I don't know. I don't know that any of them. They probably ran lines. Some of them, I would
I'm
guess.
pretty sure they did, Mike. I can remember seeing pictures of Quincy running lines on a Quincy engine there.
Well,
And like you said, they would have been supplementing the water supply, running additional lines.
Because that's a lot of communities, 19, isn't it?
it sure is.
Considering very seldom the out-of-town companies respond to fires in Boston. Usually they'll come in and cover when we have a big fire. It's very rare to have outside companies come to it. It does happen periodically, but it is very
So Eric,
scarce.
you work that area now too, right? Dorchester, that whole area. What is that? Is that your
It's not my
area?
district, but I do roam around there a lot.
All right, so they said it was $750,000 in damage in Clarida's report. And then when somebody else wrote it, I don't know, it was you, Mike, it was today's dollar 6.2 million. But when that was written, a 3 or 2 decker in Dorchester, Eric, is a million, million and a half today. So that would have
If you
been a
sold the whole thing.
financially devastating fire back in today's dollars, right?
Well, I use your example is right down the street from my firehouse. Someone sold one for like $1 million. It's been turned into condos and it's starting at $750 a floor. So gentrification, but I also believe that the older chiefs were pretty the word I'm looking for. They didn't tend to exaggerate as much as present days.
Doesn't
I
surprise
can
me.
I can remember Elliot Bellum's website still has, well, he had a lot of stuff on there, and you would see damage, the guesstimate of the damage, and even fires I was at, I was like, oh, 50 grand. That was a room. But it's still a tightly packed area, and I believe under the right conditions, maybe not something that big could happen, but close enough. But that's just me personally. And we're pretty fortunate that almost citywide, in my time on the job, the water supply has improved so much. Last night was the first time I heard a dead hydrant in a long time. And I personally like the high pressure, but I'm not even sure they're working anymore myself. But
So,
Joe, if I could go back to something real quick, when
okay.
you were asking about the guy's synergy, so it'll be a quick story, I promise. I was acting captain at NG50 once, and of the 4 firefighters on the group, 3 of them came on the job the year I was born. And we just got ready to eat supper, and they struck a box in Charlestown, 415 Bartlett and Green. Before we left that main floor, those guys were, oh, that's Mrs. Sullivan's old house. Used to be brown, now it's green, and there's a hydrant on this corner. This is all before we left the main floor. And I remember I was so impressed. I was like, I want to get wherever I end up as officer. I want to make sure I train with the company to be able to get like that, where you know what you're going to do before you go out the door.
Mhm.
You just modify maybe certain things as you pull up and what you see. But I wanted to speak on that synergy, and I think there's a tendency now to encourage micromanaging, and I believe like Patton, tell them what you want and get out of the way.
Yeah.
So
Well, let me ask you that because I'm just one, we all look at the world today. I look at Marines, I look at airline pilots, my profession where I spent decades. Um, if there was a fire, God forbid a fire like Bellflower started in Boston, and I don't think any of you can say it couldn't happen, or could you?
No,
Uh,
it could, of course it
It
could.
could happen.
Yeah.
How well would these younger firefighters fight that fire, given that they don't fight as many fires as the old timers? Am I off here, or how would they
no,
fight
I
these fires?
personally, I per vast majority of them are veterans, and a lot of them are combat veterans. I believe they would rise up to the occasion. Um, I'm fortunate that where I work, my group, I love my guys. They're great. They give me 100%. And so my mentality is I try to control their aggression and like kind of steer them in the right way. So I believe most would rise up. I also believe in Chief Christian and Mike could expand on this is at least the quality of equipment has improved like significantly. Um, I only see the old pictures, but there was a lot of bad looking trucks in those pictures that looked like they were in tough shape when they had the fire. So I think we're fortunate now, but I think the members would rise to the occasion. Um, Pretty much that's it.
Yeah, no, no, I get it. I think, yeah.
I agree with what you
Paul?
said, Eric. I have no doubt about the members today that run the department. They'd certainly, they're well-trained, well-equipped, and I think they'd be right in the thick of it, giving it a good battle. But Eric, you just alluded to the condition of the apparatus, how it was in 1964, and it was really terrible. And that, unfortunately, the men made up for the poor apparatus and just being, wooden ships and iron men. They were definitely iron
Yeah,
men.
yeah. I think those members then did a yeoman job. Um, like I said, you just see the pictures. I'm surprised it didn't jump a few more streets myself personally. And to know that, you see a picture of and I like the way them trucks look, but you see a picture like a 47 Mac that should have been jumped 10 years earlier, and in those cotton hose that weighed a ton. I think they did an awesome job limiting injuries and limiting the fire to what it was. Um, Especially, I mean, as Chief Christian said, they had good water then, but for a long time, certain parts of the city had shitty water too at the same time. Um, so I think it was awesome. I think they should come up with a program for new officers and new chiefs that kind of, if maybe not that, something like Ming's Market to try to like talk about strategy and tactics and learn from other people's mistakes or whatever, um like it's more than just history to me. You could take something out of it. um like I'll probably read Chief Clarity's thing a few times. um Boy, they write better than we do now.
Don't they ever? Oh, yeah.
This has been great. I really appreciate you taking your time to do this right before Christmas. I'd like to do some more when we figure something out because your institutional knowledge is off the chart. It's awesome. Really is. Appreciate it.
Thanks.